Hello, my name is Jeff Liebman. I'm the minister here at the Thomas Jefferson Unitarian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. The inclement weather that's being predicted for tomorrow night is canceling our open campus dinner and talk that I had planned to give on the Church of the Future. So after consulting with the adult religious exploration leaders, we have decided to cancel tomorrow's session and go ahead and go with the dinner next Wednesday, but that I would go ahead and record the talk that I had planned on giving tomorrow night so that not only those who were attending the session, but anyone could watch this and respond or carry on the conversation about the Church of the Future. So let me start with the structure of what I want to present to you today. And it starts with this first chart here. In order to discuss the Church of the Future, I think we need to look at first what are the trends in American religion. We know some of these because they've been reported on quite widely in the media. And given that, what's the relevant history of Unitarian Universalism? And then how do we combine those two to interpret what our future vision should be? And then finally, given all of that, what might the Thomas Jefferson Unitarian Church look like in 2030, 2050, 2100? As a longtime strategic planner, it's never too soon to be looking into the future. And I think if we look into even the long-term future, it will help guide our actions and decisions today. So let me start with the trends of American religion. And I think you can just barely see the trends here on this flip chart. The first, and this is the most widely reported, is the rise of the so-called nones. These are people who are either atheist or agnostic or the ubiquitous spiritual but not religious group, or just the non-believers. They go by many, many names. And we know from all the polling that these numbers have been increasing a great deal in recent years. Now, ironically, when you look at the history of the Gallup poll, for instance, which goes back to 1948 on this, the membership in Jewish synagogues has stayed roughly the same over that 70-year period. The Catholic Church also has waxed and waned, but is still roughly the same as it was in 1948. The major decline, however, is in the Protestant churches, which have dropped from 68% of the people who identify as Protestant to 37%, a rather massive decline. Some of these people have gone to what they would call self-identify as non-denominational, but another large portion of them became the so-called non-religious, the nones. And this group has grown from about 10% of the population to 18% just in the last 10 years. And this follows a trend that's been happening in Europe for a long time. Church attendance in Europe has plummeted over recent decades, especially since World War II. So this is an enormous trend in American religion right now, that many, many, many people who grew up, who were learned and were taught a Protestant version of Christianity, have since dropped away from the church and have either gone to a more generic, either like a megachurch or a non-denominational affiliation, or they have simply stopped going to church altogether. That's the trend. We'll talk about the impacts of the trends later. The second trend is the decline of attendance, of church attendance. Now, this is beyond self-identity. This is just how many people are coming across the door on a Sunday morning. Since 1992, regular attendance in church, now this is self-reported attendance at church, has dropped from 70 to 55%. Now, I don't put a lot of weight on the exact numbers because this is one of those areas of survey research that ironically is called the halo effect. When you ask people what their behaviors are, they will often want to portray themselves as they wish they were, or as they want people to see them as, and not necessarily what they really do. So, you know, it may be that 55% of the American public wishes it attended church regularly, but that number may be actually much smaller. But the relevant point to us is that that number has declined dramatically in recent years. And just since 2016, the number of people who indicate a religious affiliation and the proportion of that that are actually members of a church has also declined drastically. Roughly 79–80% of Americans affiliate with some religion, but only 55 indicate that they are actually members of a church community or a religious community of any kind. That's a rather large gap, and the gap is growing. The changing view of the world. Now this one, the major factor here is age. And this has obviously been reflected here at Thomas Jefferson. Like many Unitarian Universalist churches, we have an aging demographic. People from the baby boomer generation grew up as churchgoers. It has been normalized in their lives forever. And by and large, Gen Xers and Gen Yers also followed along with the baby boomer trend. But the millennial generation, people born from the late 80s to 2000, are not following that trend at all. They are less than half as likely to attend a church regularly as those from baby boomer and other generations that are older. And a lot of this is simply because they see the world differently. One information source that I'll commend to you is there's a university called Beloit College in Illinois. And every year they do what's called their mindset list. And what they do is they come up with this list of 30, 40 things that incoming freshmen of that year, facts that are true about them, that might alarm someone who's from an older generation. So for instance, if you look at the mindset list for the freshman class of 2014, so now we're looking at young adults who are in their mid-20s, they've perhaps graduated from college or they've been working already for a substantial amount of time. They probably are, maybe married and may have kids. So these were some of the items that were on the mindset list of that freshman class. So these would have been young people born in the mid-90s. Once they got through security, going to the airport has always resembled going to the mall. They've always had a chance to do community service with local and federal programs to earn money for college. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has always been on the Supreme Court. The people of this nation have never approved of the job that Congress is doing. Nirvana is on the classics oldie channel. But more important for our purposes are some of these issues of communication. Many have never learned how to write in cursive. Email is too slow for this generation, and they almost never use snail mail. They have never twisted the coil of the handset wire aimlessly around their wrist while they were chatting on a phone. Some don't even know how to use a rotary phone. They are used to always having hundreds of cable channels with nothing to watch. They've never seen a carousel of Kodachrome slides. And they've never recognized that pointing to your wrist means asking what time it is. These are generalizations and some meant to be humorous, but they give us an idea that a young adult today looks at the world in a very, very different way than someone of my generation who is in their early 60s or 70s. The fourth point, why attend church? This is another thing that has changed a great degree to somewhat in recent years. 2017 Gallup poll asked people various issues and were they a major factor in their decision to attend church regularly. The number one was having sermons that teach. That was indicated as a major factor by 76% of the respondents. Having sermons that connect religion to life, 75%. So right off the bat, first two things are all about the sermons and their relevance. Children and youth programming came in at 64%. Community outreach and volunteer opportunities, 59%. Having inspiring leaders, 54%. And now this is interesting. Sixth place, the sixth most important thing, social activities, at only 49%. And music, also at only 49%. And when you look at the things that our churches tend to focus on, worship services and sermons are always at the top, but we also always place a great deal of emphasis on social activities and music. And it turns out that by and large, the American people today, those aren't even top 5 issues that determine whether or not they go to church. And then we have, why don't they go to church? Now this one, there's one gigantic, glaring answer. And that is that people today oftentimes worship on their own. They do things outside the walls of a church. That comes in at 44%. So almost half of Americans, a major factor that they do not attend church is that they do something on their own. Followed by other answers like, I don't like organized religion, 36%. I'm not very religious, 33%. I haven't found a church I like, 33%. I don't have enough time, 19%. And now, way down the list, after even a few more things, comes, I don't feel welcome at church, at 16%. Now again, that's an area that we spend a lot of time on, about sending out the message that we are inclusive. And yet, only 1 in 6 Americans say that that's a major factor that they don't attend churches regularly. So those are the trends. Now, let's go back up to our first chart. What's the relevant history of Unitarian Universalism that might influence how we address these trends? Now, before the early and mid-1800s, all Unitarians and all Universalists were Christian. There was no such thing as a non-Christian Unitarian Universalist. And that held true well into the 1800s. Now, you had people like Thomas Jefferson and others who were deists, who were what mainstream Christians might call fringe Christians. But they still would have identified as Christian. They still called Jesus Christ. So they might have been free thinkers, but they weren't that free in their thinking. Then in the 1830s and 40s, you have Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, the whole transcendentalist movement. Now that brings in this question of what the nature of God is and moves us beyond the Abrahamic view of God or the Trinitarian view of God to God as fill in the blank, the universe, nature, all existence, you name it. And that's a thread that has run through to today's Unitarian Universalist Church. Again, in the 1830s and 40s, you have the abolitionist movement, women's suffrage movement, temperance, all these other justice issues all of a sudden become very important because they were being led in large part by Unitarian ministers, but also funded by Unitarians and Universalists. So social justice became an integral part of being a Unitarian or Universalist. Now, you have to remember that that's wildly revolutionary. No church prior to this had ever even conceived the notion that the church should take a role in changing social policy. Now, of course, when one looks back, there have been separation of church and state issues. But this is talking about the congregants actually committing to changing society the way it is. No church has ever talked about that. And this goes on even after the Civil War. You have Henry Bergh, who forms the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Clara Barton, who creates the American Red Cross. You have many, many Unitarians and Universalists who are creating entities. Dorothea Dix, who revolutionizes the way prisoners and the mentally ill are treated in hospitals and prisons. We lead the way on this. And again, I think it's an area that we lead today. The late 1800s, you have the social gospel movement. This is something that Unitarians and Universalists got very involved in, although we were still one of the smaller churches involved in this movement. But this is where people sent missionaries out. And so this is how we made our connections with people in Japan, people in the Kazi Hills in India. We reconnected with the Transylvanian Unitarian churches. And we still have those international connections today. Now you move to the 1920s and 30s, and you have the rise of humanism. The first Humanist Manifesto in 1933 is largely written by scientists and people who would, if they identified with a religion at all, would have very likely identified as Unitarian or Universalist. Now that creates the ongoing conflict, difference of opinion, difference worldview among our members about the nature of church. And this really goes back much further and became really evident in 1961 when the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America decided to merge. The merger was done mostly for financial reasons, but the fact was that the two churches did a lot of things in concert already. Their youth programs had already merged. They were doing a lot of social justice work together. But theologically, the merger didn't really make a whole lot of sense, other than the fact that the Unitarians and the Universalists were both regarded by mainstream Christianity as out there. And they weren't involved in a lot of interfaith activities. We were seen as heretical. So it did make sense, in one sense, for us to get together just to survive financially. But it has exacerbated the rift between, and not only on theological grounds, but other grounds. Unitarians who tended to be New England, well-off financially, very educated, and Universalists who tended to be very rural, far less educated, far less financially well-off, and much more spiritual, much more comfortable with God language than the high-minded intellectual Unitarians. This conflict has, in my opinion at least, gotten little to no resolution since the merger and continues to be a problem for us. The last issue of Unitarian Universalist that's relevant is, we often talk about our living tradition with a capital L and capital T. Change has always been an integral part of Unitarian and Universalist thinking. And again, you have to put that in context. There aren't a lot of churches that would say that. Most churches, if you look at the Roman Catholic Church, change is glacial. When it happens at all. There are certain Protestant denominations that would argue they haven't changed since the time Jesus trod the earth. But for us, change has always been welcome. One of the problems with that is that we have become sort of a catch-all in many ways. And a lot of times we look at change and we can easily look at it as change for change's sake, rather than it's a matter of adaptation and evolution, which ideas we should embrace, given that Darwin is one of us. But we must resist this notion that we are the church where you're free to believe anything you want to believe, which sadly is the elevator speech that way too many Unitarian Universalists use when someone says, "Oh, Unitarian, well, what's that?" You know, and you've only got 25 words. Well, you're free to believe whatever you want. That sends a horrible message about who we are, and also provides the listener with no real idea of what our identity is. So, how do we interpret these as a future vision? We have to recognize that we need to change, and we need to embrace that as just something that's part of our tradition, of our existence as a religious community. But we have to do that change intelligently. We can't change so much that we get out ahead of people and they can't catch up with us. And part of the problem is that as change has become part of our culture, it's almost become necessary from a more psychological standpoint, for our denomination, the psyche of our denomination. It's almost been a case of an addiction to change, that we need to change even if we don't need to change. And this is something I've experienced here at Thomas Jefferson. I think this is a church that I see as one that has relatively little conflict. I think the culture here has not just been Midwest nice, but a group of people that really honestly do get along very well and are able to resolve differences fairly easily. But I have seen examples of times where conflict was almost created to fill the void of there being no conflict. And that's something we UUs we're not only very good at, but we must very much caution ourselves against. Generally, we love the arguments, we love the process, we love the putting up flip charts and asking everyone's opinions and then ranking them, and it's just something Unitarian Universalists love to do. That's kind of not normal. A lot of people don't like that, but we seem to love that. We seem to love the cauldron of ideas. But the problem with that is that it creates not just a culture of change, but a culture of instability, a culture where nothing is ever solved and nothing is ever right. And that's a risk, and I don't think Thomas Jefferson is there, but it's a risk we run if we don't recognize our common grounds. Another element is just this whole notion of what is our identity. Given that we still have this holdover of differences between the Unitarian Church and the Universalist Church, and now there's so many of our members, especially in the Midwest. The churches I've served in the Midwest were lucky if they had a handful, if any, people who were born Unitarian Universalist. They were all come-inners from either other religions or no religious background. That, in a sense, if it's if we go overboard on the recognition of our differences and the embracing of our differences, we almost become the island of misfit toys. We become a church where everybody is an oddball, or everybody is, somehow not normal. Now, I loathe the term normal. I don't think there's any such thing as normal, but outside the mainstream, almost as if we We try to be eclectic. We try to be avant-garde because that's our identity. That may serve us who are already members of our churches because that's how we see ourselves. But that's a big turnoff to visitors. There will be the occasional visitor who is like that too, and they'll go, wow, this is the place for me. But people who are generally a nun, people who are non-religious, maybe they were never raised in any religious tradition, and that's becoming far more prevalent today. They're not looking for quirky. They're not looking for oddball. They're looking for a church that they can see being a member of. And maybe they're not all that unusual. They want some stability. So we have to change, but we have to change intelligently. And we have to change when we need to change. And hopefully foresee those changes before we need to do them. So that takes us to our last point. What's this place going to look like? Not just, next year when you call your settled minister, or hopefully 10 or 20 years down the road when your settled minister has been here a long time. What's this church, and by extension any Unitarian Universalist church, going to look like 30 years from now, 70 years from now, in the year 2100? What are our churches going to look like? And obviously, I'm a science fiction person, but I don't have any brilliant answers to this. I have questions. Are we going to need a building at all? Obviously, one of the key elements of a religious community is the face-to-face interaction of individuals. But as technology gets better and better and better, and we've seen movies where they even have avatars that go out into the world and do all their interaction for them. One wonders if we're even going to need a building at all. Or if we have a building, is it basically just going to be a sanctuary and that's it, nothing else? Will the Sunday morning worship service even survive? Is that going to become an anachronism in a day and age when there are certainly no blue laws left, nothing even resembling blue laws? The only difference in Sunday nowadays is the stores open a couple hours later and close a little earlier. But I would get, if you ask me to look into my crystal ball, I think that's going to go away in another 10 or 20 years. The consumer attitude in this country is simply not going to allow it to exist. And especially as church attendance declines, sooner or later, Madison Avenue is going to see that there's a lot of people sitting out there on Sunday morning with nothing to do. So why not open up the stores? Children's activities, and whether it's soccer or hockey or you name it, those have been spilling over into Sundays for a long time. And who knows what the future of the school is going to be like? Are schools going to move to different days? Are they going to move to a non-agrarian calendar where they're not just meeting September to June, but going year round, going into the weekends, doing all kinds of things? They're going to be the one thing we can be certain of is the increase of competition for activities on Sunday morning is going to continue to grow. So will the Sunday morning service even survive? Especially as we continue to improve our outreach to people by recording services, by live streaming services. The unfortunate consequence of that is that there'll be less necessity for people to actually be here physically in the building. Will our church structures change radically? We clearly, and I think most churches would fall into this, churches tend to be very silo structured. There tends to be, the minister and the prophetic ministry, and then your lifelong religious exploration or your family ministry, those things. Your justice ministry, your arts ministry, all these missions of the church have all tended to be very separate. Is that going to continue? Is it even logical for that to continue in the future? We're already doing a lot of intentional intersectional work between these. Whenever I design a service, I'm always in conversation with Barb, with Frank and Linda, with Janet on all these issues of not just what's my sermon going to be, but how are we going to, set up the building that day? Are there going to be corollary activities going on that day? It's becoming a much more integrated experience on Sunday mornings. So the question really comes down to this, and I think this is probably the most constructive way to look at it. If Thomas Jefferson Unitarian Church didn't exist, however you want to say that, we get hit by a bolt of lightning and the property goes up in flames, or there's an earthquake, or whatever. If this church did not exist here and now, and you're going to build a church, what would it look like? Would it look like the building you built 34 years ago? Probably not. In fact, I would say I certainly hope not. The building that you have now started out as one thing and then was added on to several times. So it already is not a uniform presentation of what a church maybe should be. It's not the most efficient use of the space or the structure. It's the most efficient you could do given the limitations and certainly given the financial resources. But assuming, let's say, the property was destroyed and you got a gigantic insurance, you got $2 million or whatever. Assuming that money was not a limiting factor, what would you erect here? What would it look like? What would the organization be like? What would the staffing be like? Would you have all the same policies and procedures relating to membership or to how you organize your social activities, your program activities? And my tendency is to think it would look very noticeably different from what you currently have. And as the years go on, it will become radically different. And I don't know where we go from here. If you look at church a couple hundred years ago, there were no hymns sung in church. Singing in church was viewed as heretical. It was sacrilegious. Well, no one even thinks about that nowadays. The Sunday service hymn has become a staple. There were many other things that were very common in churches in the past 100, 200 years that are now long gone. So the notion that church is going to stay the way it is right now is a very dangerous notion. So if you wanted to appeal to the millennials and future generations, what are you going to need to change in order to do that, given that they see the world in a very different way than people in my generation see it, given that their finances are different, their family structures and practices are different. Given the state of religion in the world today in general, how would we construct the church? How should our church change? Are we, and I hate to use the term marketing, but are we marketing ourselves accurately? Is the image we're putting out there really who we are? Are we being honest? Are we being sincere? And are we really looking at how we really want people to see us? And how people should see us. So that's why a lot of times I talk about living our principles, leaning into our principles. It's real easy for almost anyone to read our 7 principles and go, well, yeah, it makes sense. Nothing here that's all that objectionable. Even if I personally have some biases against certain people, I can kind of agree that everyone has inherent worth and dignity. And I don't think there's anything in our 7 principles that the average Christian is going to go, like what they react to is the fact that we don't have anything in there about God or Jesus or anything else. But my brother, who is as far right as you can go fundamentalist Baptist, doesn't disagree with anything in our principles. He still thinks I'm going to hell because I haven't accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. But otherwise, he pretty much agrees with our principles. So what is our image? I think our image needs to be something more than the general statement of principles that we managed to come to consensus on, because we know Unitarian Universalists are terrible at coming to consensus on anything. And I think that means that we need to look, not just at the building and not just at our organizational structure, but to us ourselves. What image do we want the world to see when they look at us? And I think that's when we get into things like, do we acknowledge the impact of our privilege in general as Unitarian Universalists, as predominantly white, as predominantly middle and upper class, as predominantly well-educated, none of which are bad in and of themselves, but all of them provide for us a sense of privilege that we directly or indirectly take advantage of simply because we were born who we are and were raised the way we were. We have to recognize that others see that too. And that's part of their judgment when they decide do they want to be with us in religious community. So it may be easy for us to be welcoming, let's say, to LGBTQ individuals because they look like us, and even though LGBT folks tend to be much poorer, it's easy for us to accept that, to welcome that. But how welcoming are we to people of color, to people of very poor economic means? Someone who is on welfare is going to feel welcome in our community of people. And I think this is why, I've been pushing people to look at things, the practices of the church, to see what kind of indirect messages they may be sending to people. Totally, completely unintended messages, but looking at the church through the eyes of the other, the person who isn't here now, who isn't like us generally. And I think those are the kinds of things we need to be doing when we look into the future. Yeah, we also need to be looking at, 30 years from now, are you just going to be on your sofa at home on Sunday morning and you just kind of go to your brain implant and go connect, boom, and virtual reality, you're physically, all that's possible and probably incredibly likely. But that's going to happen whether we do anything about it or not. We're not the people that are going to be inventing that technology. What we can invent is who we are. What we can reinvent is who we want to be. And I think that's the future of church. Whether you do it intentionally or not, you always create your own identity. And I'd rather always do it intentionally. So that people see us for who we want them to see us as. And I think that's how a church is going to survive. If people see a community that's relevant to their lives and does all the things that, the surveys tell us people go to church for. People go to church to learn. People go to church to connect what they're learning to their lives. They go for children and youth programming, so that they want to go as families. They want to reach out to the world. They want to be part of something bigger than themselves. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge for Unitarian Universalists. I always tell people, whenever someone criticizes the Catholic Church, I always say, back off a minute there. Now, I don't necessarily like the way they do it, always, but no church does more for the poor, for the sick, the homeless, the prisoner. The Catholics do a hell of a job caring for the oppressed. Could they do more? Absolutely, but they do a lot more than we do. Whether it's on an obviously an absolute scale, of course, they're way bigger than us, so of course they do. But I think even on a per capita scale, you know, on a per person kind of scale, they do far more than we do. It's part of their culture. It's what they're known for. And that's what I want us to look at, is what do we want to be known for? Now, I don't think we're ever going to be the church that runs a food bank and a homeless shelter and a this and that. I mean, you know, will we ever have the resources for that? Probably not. But can we be the church that's in Frankfurt, leaning on legislators hard and, you know, helping to foment legislation? Sure we could. You know, are we the ones that could, like Greg Fisher said this last Sunday, can we be the ones out there making this a more compassionate city? Absolutely. Absolutely. We can be a complete leader in that. So those are the things I think we need to look at when we look at the church of the future, is with intent, with meaningfulness, looking at everything we do and not simply taking it for granted that that's, you know, we're going to keep doing it the way we've always done it because that's the way we've always done it. But say, what is our mission? Who are we? And how do we want people to see us as who we are? That will drive the decisions. You know, that will determine what the future of our church will look like. Well, I hope you've enjoyed sharing these thoughts with you, and I hope it will encourage further discussion. And again, I hope you will come to the Open Campus dinner next Wednesday, the 7th, October 7th, I believe, and start coming to classes. I'll be doing a class on the sources of Unitarian Universalism. This is part of, you know, what our principles that people often don't look at. When you look at our hymnal, you know, everyone has probably seen the 7 principles, you know, here. But below it is an equally important part of our statement, which is the sources from which we derive our living tradition. These include direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder, words and deeds of prophetic men and women, wisdom from all the world's religions, Jewish and Christian teachings, humanist teachings, and spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions. I'll be doing a class on those sources, where we'll talk about what role they play in the modern Unitarian Universalist Church. We have other classes as well. I encourage you to look online at those. We offer really educational and fun programs for people during the winter months and during the fall. So I encourage you to look us up and to become active in our religious community. Thanks. This is Rev Jeff signing off. Have a good day.